When people think of video games in the year 1983, what most often comes to mind is the North American video game crash of the same year and Atari's commercially disastrous ET game. But 1983 almost became known for something very different, as Atari came within an inch of securing the rights to sell Nintendo's Famicom console to not just the US, but to all markets outside of Japan. After numerous meetings and negotiations, a tentative agreement between Nintendo and Atari that included minimum order requirements, delivery dates, and even dollar amounts had been established. The only thing left to do was to sign on the dotted line. Atari and Nintendo agreed to sign what in hindsight would have been a historic deal at 1983's Consumer Electronics Show in Chicago. Everything was on track for Atari to deliver Nintendo's 8-bit console to US shores by the 1983 holiday season, but the very site where their agreement was supposed to be made official instead became its grave. So what happened between Atari and Nintendo, and why didn't we see an NES from Atari? Today we're going to look back at a time when Nintendo approached Atari to sell its Famicom hardware, only to see one of their own creations, Donkey Kong, as well as Coleco, insider trading allegations, and the video game crash destroy the deal and forever change the landscape of the gaming industry. This is the story of Atari's Nintendo Entertainment System. Outside of Japan, Nintendo wasn't the household name that it is today. Nintendo wanted to release their upcoming Famicom console worldwide, but doing so was a risky proposition. Nintendo's previous attempts to enter the US via the arcade market were met with mixed results. While they had a big hit with Donkey Kong, other Nintendo arcade entries that had been successful in Japan, such as Radar Scope, were commercial failures in the US. Nintendo knew that success in Japan wouldn't guarantee success elsewhere. Nintendo decided that the Famicom's best chance for success abroad would be to work with a video game company that had strong brand recognition in the US and beyond. Coleco would seem like the natural choice. After all, Nintendo already had a relationship with Coleco, who Nintendo had previously licensed the rights for Donkey Kong to, specifically for use on their game consoles.
Soon you can play Donkey Kong on your ColecoVision, Atari VCS, or Intellivision home video system. Won't that be fun?
Don't worry, darling! I'll save you!
Nintendo president Hiroshi Yamauchi, however, had someone else in mind.
Mr. Yamauchi said, "Why don't you contact the Atari people?" So I called Ray Kazar, Atari president, and the next thing we knew, we were going down on a corporate check to Warner. Howard Lincoln, chairman, Nintendo of America.
But why Atari, and why in the midst of the 1983 video game crash? For one, the video game crash wasn't a singular event that flipped a switch and caused the public to immediately stop buying video games. There was still a market for video games, albeit a shrinking one. Yamauchi wasn't ignorant to the rumors of the American video game industry declining, but he felt that the Famicom was truly the best console ever created and would be immune to the issues plaguing the rest of the industry in the US. In Yamauchi's eyes, Atari's worldwide distribution channels and name brand recognition made it the best choice. Nintendo of America chairman Howard Lincoln called Atari president Ray Kazar and proposed working together. Lincoln explained that Nintendo was willing to license Atari the rights to sell the Famicom anywhere outside of Japan under the Atari brand. Kazar was interested. Howard Lincoln and the president of Nintendo of America, Minoru Arakawa, flew to Atari's headquarters to iron out the details and begin negotiations. Despite the first shipment of Famicoms being recalled to fix a defect that would cause the system to crash, the Famicom was a runaway success, selling over 500,000 units in its first 2 months alone. While it's been reported that the Famicom's sales encouraged Yamauchi to export it to the US, the Famicom wasn't released in Japan until July, and Nintendo initially reached out to Atari back in April. Even though they were the smaller brand, to Nintendo, Atari probably didn't appear to have a lot of options or leverage over the Japanese company in the negotiations.
I'd like the most popular home video game system ever.
Ah, the system you want is the Atari 2600.
That's so fast.
By 1983, the Atari 2600 was outdated. The 5200 sales were stagnant, and thanks in part to ET's poor reception, Atari's 1982 holiday season sales were very underwhelming. Atari, however, felt differently, and saw negotiating with Nintendo as a can't-lose situation. If a deal wasn't reached with Nintendo, Atari would have delayed a competitor's entrance into the US market with the negotiations, all while General Computer Corporation worked on Atari's upcoming 7800 system. If a deal was reached, Atari would have a plan B in case the 7800 didn't meet expectations. During Nintendo and Atari's first meeting, Arakawa described the Famicom and answered questions from a bevy of Atari lawyers and executives. Things went well enough that a follow-up meeting was set up for Atari to fly to Kyoto, Japan to see the Famicom in person. Ray Kassar didn't attend the meeting in Kyoto, but in his place went half a dozen Atari managers and Senior Vice President and General Counsel Skip Paul, who joined Nintendo's Howard Lincoln, Minoru Arakawa, and Hiroshi Yamauchi himself. After Nintendo's Famicom demonstration, the real negotiations began. Yamauchi disappeared and reappeared several times throughout the negotiations, a tactic that he frequently used to make those sitting across the negotiation table think that he had more important business to tend to. Although there was some back and forth over percentage points and royalties, Nintendo was for the most part getting everything that they asked for. Some of Nintendo's terms were as follows. Nintendo would build and test the Famicom boards, which Atari would then purchase for 5,300 yen each. Nintendo would only disclose the electrical specifications for the PPU and CPU, but would not disclose any of their programming specs. Nintendo would program games of Atari's choosing and sell them assembled, unlabeled cartridges for 1,500 yen each, with a minimum order of 100,000 units per title. Atari would also have to commit to a minimum purchase of 2 million hardware units broken up into 1 million NTSC, 700,000 PAL, and 300,000 CCAM units. Money-wise, Nintendo would receive $5 million upon signing as an advance against future payments. Nintendo would also receive an additional $3.5 million line of credit as an advance towards future payments upon delivery of the first prototype of the PAL version of the Famicom, as well as an additional advance of $1.5 million for the CCAM. The length of the contract was for 4 years, with a renewal option for another 4. To meet FCC requirements, Nintendo would need to make changes to the Famicom board that would prevent them from fitting in the original Famicom shells. It would be left up to Atari to design a new shell for their version of the Famicom. Nintendo wanted to get Atari's Famicom, or NES if you prefer, into stores outside of Japan by the Christmas season. To that end, Nintendo committed to produce 100,000 units of the assembled and tested PC boards by August 31st, as well as 4 titles. According to an Atari interoffice memo, the negotiations occurred between May 17th and May 20th of 1983, making August 31st delivery date a very short turnaround. After several days of negotiating, Howard Lincoln used one of Yamauchi's disappearances to warn Atari's delegation that Mr. Yamauchi was growing impatient with the negotiations, and if a deal wasn't reached soon, he may pull out. Skip Paul and Atari's reps then went to a private room to call Ray Kassar. When Atari's team returned, Skip Paul announced that Atari had approved the deal and asked Howard Lincoln to write up the contracts.
I mean, it was a done deal. We spent a week putting this thing together, this elaborate agreement in Kyoto. Skip Paul was over there. We had the whole thing put together. It was a deal. Howard Lincoln, Chairman, Nintendo of America.
It was agreed that they would all meet again in Chicago the following month to sign the contracts at the June Consumer Electronics Show. But instead of being the site of the beginning of a pivotal partnership for the video game industry, CES would become the site of the beginning of the end. Nintendo's Hiroshi Yamauchi, Minoru Arakawa, and Howard Lincoln arrived at CES ready to close their deal with Atari. Instead, they were greeted by anger. Atari became incensed when they discovered that Coleco was showing off a new version of Donkey Kong in its CES booth. As I mentioned earlier, Coleco had licensed the rights to produce home console Donkey Kong games from Nintendo. Meanwhile, Atari had the rights for Donkey Kong computer games. The problem was that Coleco's new Donkey Kong game was running on Atom, Coleco's new home computer. Atari felt double-crossed by Nintendo. Atari accused Nintendo of double-dealing behind their back and threatened to not only pull out of the Famicom deal, but to also take legal action. That very evening, Nintendo called for an emergency meeting with Coleco CEO Arnold Greenberg in Nintendo's hotel suite. The book Game Over recounts the meeting in great detail. When Nintendo president Hiroshi Yamauchi arrived, he was described as becoming unglued. Yamauchi began pointing at Coleco's Arnold Greenberg and yelling in Japanese. Coleco argued that they thought of the Atom as a computer-like exterior with a video game console on the inside. Coleco had no idea that they had just destroyed a multi-million-dollar deal for Nintendo. Yamauchi didn't accept Coleco's excuses, and angrily demanded that Coleco not sell Donkey Kong for the Atom, or Nintendo would sue them for everything that they were worth. Coleco had little choice. Later that evening, Yamauchi turned to Howard Lincoln and said,
Sometimes this is the way you have to handle people, Mr. Lincoln. What did you think about that performance?
Coleco's Donkey Kong cartridge for the Atom computer may have been the catalyst, but the Atari Nintendo deal may have been doomed from the beginning. Ray Kassar was the president of Atari and one of the deal's biggest supporters. He was fired the month after CES amidst allegations of insider trading. In September of 1983, Nintendo, Atari, and Coleco held a meeting where they reached a compromise on Donkey Kong. The issues preventing Atari and Nintendo from moving forward with their deal had been resolved, but despite Nintendo's best efforts, Atari would never sign the contract. The months between Kassar's firing and the trio of companies meeting were not financially kind to Atari. In truth, none of the months that year were. In the first 9 months of 1983, Atari reported losses totaling more than $500 million. As 1983 continued, a quarter of Atari's employees were laid off, games were being sold for a tenth of their original price, Atari's parent company, Warner Communications, took a big hit in the stock market. Projects were cancelled, and numerous Atari offices were closed. The video game crash of 1983 was now in full swing, and Atari could no longer afford to sign the deal. Later, there were rumors that Atari never intended to sign. Allegedly, a lawyer that previously worked for Warner Communications informed Nintendo that Atari never even had the money to buy the rights to the Famicom. He said that the negotiations were nothing more than a ploy to delay Nintendo reaching markets outside of Japan.
Atari just reinvented the video game with this, the Atari 7800. Incredible, huh?
As the story goes, Atari saw the 7800 as the superior machine and felt that it had more potential than the Famicom.
Oh, the new Atari 7800. We reinvented the video game.
I was unable to confirm whether or not that story is true, but with the discovery of a Nintendo port of Joust, programmed by Satoru Iwata himself specifically for the Atari Famicom, it seems more likely to me that Atari and Nintendo both intended to go through with the deal. Whatever their intent was, Atari had hedged their bets by continuing to develop the 7800 and planned to release it in May of 1984. However, due to the sale of the company, the 7800 was cancelled, and it wouldn't see its release until 1986. Nintendo would go on to release the Famicom in the US on their own as the Nintendo Entertainment System in October of 1985, beating Atari's 7800 system to market by nearly 8 months. By 1988, the Atari 7800 had sold 1 million units during its first 2 years. Meanwhile, Nintendo sold 1.1 million NESs in 1986 alone. Whether by choice, circumstance, or a combination of both, Atari had bet on the wrong horse. 1983 is often regarded as the year that Atari and the rest of the video game industry imploded, but 1983 was also the year that Atari almost had it all. This episode is brought to you by Super Jump Magazine and the Super Jump Podcast. They're big fans of the channel, and their magazine is all about celebrating the art and science of video games. Be sure to check them out at superjump.online. A big thank you to Guru Larry, aka Larry Bundy Jr., for voicing Howard Lincoln in this episode. If you enjoy excellent video gaming content and aren't already one of his 300,000 plus subscribers, I highly recommend that you remedy that by searching for Larry Bundy Jr. on YouTube or by following the link to his channel in the description below. I'd also like to thank Alexis for providing the original artwork in this video. You can see more of her art at sakebombshu.tumblr.com. And last but not least, I'd like to thank Roman Apples for providing the voice of Hiroshi Yamauchi. You can follow the link to his channel in the description below for content ranging from irreverent podcasts, animated shorts, gaming rants, original music, and much more. If you'd like to reach out to me directly, you can do so on Twitter at WrestlesGaming. If you'd like to support my channel monetarily, I've sold out and set up an account on Patreon at patreon.com/wrestlingwithgaming. For more gaming history, be sure to check out my gaming documentaries playlist, and most importantly, thank you for watching.